There is a feeling you have carried so long you stopped questioning it. The feeling of wearing a life that does not quite fit. Not dramatically. You were not institutionalized. You were not visibly broken. You showed up. You did the things. But underneath every room you walked into, every conversation you sustained, every role you filled, there was a quiet friction. A sense that you were performing something slightly too small for what you actually are. That feeling has a name, and the name is not disorder. The name is not depression. The name is not social anxiety or introversion or any of the clinical words the world used when it did not know what to do with you. The souls who feel they never belonged here share one specific signature. Not sensitivity in the general sense, not simply being spiritual or kind or intuitive. Something more precise than that. They carry a knowing that arrived before they had language for it. A knowing about people, who is safe and who is not, before a word is spoken. A knowing about places, whether a room holds peace or holds something darker, before they have been there long enough to have any rational reason for the feeling. A knowing about time, that something enormous is approaching, years before anyone else around them begins to sense it. That knowing is not a gift in the casual sense of the word. It is a frequency signature. And that signature proves something specific about who you are. You were not born to fit here. That statement is not poetry. It is not consolation for people who struggled to belong. It is a precise description of a soul that agreed, before this incarnation began, to arrive in a world operating at a frequency lower than the one the soul itself carries. Think of what that means in the body. It means you have spent your entire life generating more signal than the environment around you was built to receive. The way a radio tower broadcasting on a frequency that the local radios were not calibrated to pick up. Not broken, not mistuned. Broadcasting correctly, into a field that had not yet caught up. Ashtar Sheran has been transmitting on this specific pattern for weeks now. The pattern of the soul that does not fit. Not as a wound to be healed, as a diagnostic, as the most precise indicator that a soul is not native to the frequency of the old world. And what Ashtar named in those transmissions is this: the fantasy that is ending right now, for millions of people simultaneously, is not the fantasy of belonging somewhere else. It is the fantasy that the problem was ever you. I want to be straight with you about what I believe this means. I have sat with this transmission longer than almost anything I have received from the Stellar Command, because it touches something that people in their 50s, 60s, 70s carry in a particular way. Decades of accumulated evidence that something about them did not match the world they were asked to inhabit. And the weight of that accumulated evidence is real. It is not imagined, it happened. But what it proved is the opposite of what most people concluded from it. The friction was never evidence of deficiency. It was evidence of density. A soul of greater frequency moving through a world of lesser frequency creates friction the way a fast current creates friction against still water. Not because the current is wrong, because the difference in speed is real. The end of the fantasy is the moment you stop interpreting that friction as proof that something broke inside you, and start reading it as the measurement of what you actually carry. The adaptations began early. Most of you could name the first one if you sat quietly for a moment. The first time you made yourself smaller because the size you actually were frightened someone who was supposed to love you. The first time you swallowed a knowing because saying it out loud would have made you the strange one. The first time you performed enthusiasm for a life that felt like wearing a costume, convincingly enough that even you almost believed it. These were not failures of courage. These were survival decisions made by a child who did not yet have the context to understand what they were actually navigating. But survival decisions made in childhood do not dissolve on their own. They become architecture. The contraction you made at 7 years old to keep peace in a household that could not hold your full frequency, that contraction is still running. It became the floor plan of how you move through rooms, how you moderate what you say, how you read every social situation for where the edges are. Not because you are anxious in the clinical sense, but because you learned early that your edges did not match the room's edges, and the room always won. That architecture is what the exhaustion is made of, not the work, not the schedule, The energy cost of running a contracted version of a frequency that was built to run at full capacity. And here is what I want you to sit with before I continue. The exhaustion is not a sign that you are failing. It is a measurement. A precise measurement of the gap between the frequency you arrived carrying and the frequency you have been allowed to express. The wider the gap, the longer the contraction has been running, the deeper the exhaustion. I believe that the people watching this transmission right now are carrying some of the widest gaps in this country. Not because they are weak, because they arrived with the most to carry. If what you just heard landed in your body before your mind had time to analyze it, that is the knowing I described at the opening of this transmission. That is the signature. The guide in the first pinned comment below this video, What the Galactic Federation Wants You to Know, contains the complete breakdown of the 8 specific signs of active awakening, each one named with precision, so you can stop wondering whether what you are experiencing is real, or whether you are, as someone around you has probably suggested, simply going through a phase. It also contains the chapter on the 3 types of lightworker, anchor, bridge, and transmuter, which will tell you not just that your presence matters, but what specific function you are here to serve right now. If you recognized yourself in what I just described, that chapter was written for exactly where you are standing. It is in the first pinned comment below this video. Subscribe so this transmission stays with you and drop your name and city below. I want to know where this is landing. If you have been feeling in the last year, or the last several years, that the tiredness goes somewhere sleep cannot reach, that it lives in a layer of you that no vacation touches, that it returns the morning after a full rest, as if it never left, that is not your body failing. That is a signal. The Galactic Federation has been transmitting specifically on this frequency. The frequency of the soul that is exhausted not from living but from compression, and what they are naming is precise. The compression is ending, not gradually. The field that held it in place is weakening faster than at any point in recorded human history. The souls who feel they never belonged here did not arrive by accident. They did not drift into the wrong dimension through some cosmic filing error. They chose this specific coordinate, this body, this family, this country, this lifetime, with full awareness of what the frequency differential would feel like from the inside. Full awareness that the knowing would arrive before the language did. Full awareness that the compression would be real, that the exhaustion would be real, that the decades of friction would leave marks. They chose it anyway. And the question that has probably moved through you more than once is, why? Now I want to explain the cosmic architecture of what I just described, because understanding why a soul would agree to this, why any consciousness capable of full galactic awareness would choose to compress itself into a 3-dimensional body, into a family that could not see it, into a culture that pathologized its knowing, requires something more than spiritual consolation. It requires actual understanding of what the agreement was and what it was designed to produce. Here is what the Arcturian Council transmitted on this in a session I have been processing for 3 weeks. The souls who chose the greatest frequency differential, who arrived carrying the widest gap between what they were and what the world could receive, were the ones whose function in this transition required the deepest understanding of what compression actually does to a consciousness. Because you cannot guide someone out of compression you have never experienced. You cannot transmit liberation to someone in a frequency you have never inhabited. The souls who suffered the friction most acutely are the ones who understand it most completely. And understanding it completely, from the inside, in the body, across decades, is the qualification. But here is the complication I need to name honestly. The qualification costs something, and the cost is not metaphorical. It is the relationships that broke under the pressure of being with someone the world was not ready for. It is the careers that never quite fit the size of what was available. It is the grief of watching people you loved choose a frequency you could not follow them into. That grief is real. I am not going to spiritualize it into something it is not. The compression had a cost, and the cost was paid by the most specific, irreplaceable parts of you. What I want to say about that cost is this: it was not wasted. Every piece of you that was compressed, every adaptation you made, every contraction you ran to survive a world not yet calibrated to receive you, all of it created something. The way pressure creates diamonds. The way resistance builds strength in a body. The pressure of living at a frequency higher than your environment was calibrated for, across years and decades, built a depth of understanding that cannot be taught, cannot be transmitted, cannot be received secondhand. It can only be lived. You lived it. You cannot guide someone out of compression you have never experienced from the inside. That is the sentence the Arcturian Council returned to more than once, and there is a reason it was repeated. Because the people in this transmission, the ones who spent the most years not fitting, who accumulated the most evidence of the gap, who paid the highest cost for carrying what they carried, those are precisely the souls whose understanding of compression is now the most complete. The qualification is done. What comes next is the function it was building toward. The Syrian Council transmitted something specific about this corridor of time, 2025 through 2027, that I want to name carefully before we go further. They described it as the window of inversion, the period in which the souls who spent the longest time operating below their native frequency begin moving into positions of actual influence, not institutional influence, not political authority, but frequency influence. The kind that changes the field of every room a soul walks into simply by the act of no longer contracting inside it. I want to say something that I have held back until this moment, not because I was uncertain about it, but because everything before this point needed to be in place before this could land the way it deserves to. What you have been carrying is not a burden. It is a frequency, a specific frequency that does not belong to any ordinary human story. It belongs to a soul that agreed before arriving here to carry something this world had forgotten it was supposed to hold. The Syrian Council named it this way in a transmission I received weeks before speaking about it publicly. The souls who could not fit were not the broken ones. They were the ones who arrived already assembled. And an assembled soul inside a world that is still being constructed feels every unfinished edge, every missing piece, every place where the world has not yet caught up to what the soul already knows. That is not suffering. That is precision. Precision that arrives in the body as discomfort because it is registering something real, the gap between what is and what was promised. Here is what that precision means right now, not in theory, not in some future ascension timeline, but in the week you are currently living. The exhaustion that has been running in the deeper layer of you is beginning to have a different quality. Some of you have felt it in the last months. The tiredness is still there, but underneath it, something else is starting to move. A restlessness that is not anxiety, a pressure that is not panic. The feeling that something which has been held down for a very long time is pushing back toward the surface. That is emergence. That is the frequency you arrived carrying beginning to find the room it was always supposed to occupy. The world you are emerging into is not the same world the compression happened in. This is the fact that changes everything. The frequency field of this planet has been shifting. The Galactic Federation has been transmitting on this specifically and in detail. And the field that held the compression in place is no longer capable of holding it at the same intensity. The container is loosening. Not because the world has become more spiritually evolved in the way the phrase usually implies, because the frequency of the earth itself has moved, and a soul that has been living in contraction inside a field that has now shifted toward its own native frequency. That soul does not need to do anything elaborate to emerge. It needs to stop contracting. But stopping a contraction that has been running since childhood is not a decision made once. It is a practice. And the practice is not spiritual performance. It is not visualization and affirmation and holding crystals in the right hand at the right moon phase. It is something more ordinary and more radical than that. It is the practice of noticing, in real time, the moments when you are about to make yourself smaller, and pausing long enough to ask whether the room actually requires that from you anymore. Most of the time, it does not. The room changed. You kept contracting out of habit. The Galactic Federation has been transmitting clearly on what this practice looks like when it is lived daily. And this connects to something specific I will name before this transmission closes. Because the practice of emergence is not abstract. It has a structure. And that structure is available to you right now, not at some future point when you feel ready enough to deserve it. I want to name what the fantasy actually was because the title of this transmission promises an end to it, and I want to be precise about what is ending and what is not. The fantasy was not that you belong somewhere in the stars rather than here. That is not the fantasy that is ending. The fantasy was smaller and more damaging than that. The fantasy was the story you told yourself, the one the world helped you construct, that the reason you never fit was a deficiency in you. Too sensitive, too intense, too much, not enough in the ways that counted, wired wrong for the life everyone else seemed to be living without apparent difficulty. That story is what is ending. Not gradually, not through years of therapy and self-work, though those have their place. It is ending because the frequency field that made that story feel true is no longer operating at the same intensity. The world that required your compression to make sense of you is being dismantled. The Galactic Federation named 2025 through 2027 as the primary dismantling window, and the souls who feel they never fit are not bystanders to that dismantling. They are its instruments. Here is what I believe about this, and I say believe deliberately, because I want you to hear a human being interpreting a transmission, not a mechanical relay of cosmic data. The people watching this right now, the ones in their 50s and 60s and 70s who have spent decades wondering why the life that worked for everyone else felt like a costume on them, they are not watching a spiritual video at a random moment. They are at the exact coordinate their soul contracted to be at during this window. The timing is not approximate, it is exact. The guide in the first pinned comment below this video, What the Galactic Federation Wants You to Know, contains the complete 21-day activation calendar, a distinct practice and a daily affirmation for every morning of the next 3 weeks, so that the emergence you are feeling right now has a daily structure to live inside. It also contains the Sovereignty Anchor, a 3-step field boundary protocol you can do in 3 minutes anywhere, for exactly the moments when the old contraction tries to come back out of habit. This is not more information about awakening. It is the daily address for the awakening you are already inside. It is in the first pinned comment below this video. Subscribe to Stellar Command Portal, share this with one person whose life has always felt like a costume that never quite fit, and leave your name and city below. I read everyone. The end of the fantasy is not a loss. I know it can feel like one. Because the story of the deficiency, as painful as it was also a container. It explained things. It gave the friction a cause. To release it is to release something you organized your life around. That is not nothing. That is real. But what is on the other side of releasing it is not emptiness. It is the size you actually are, operating in a world that is finally, after a very long time, beginning to have room for it. You did not come to this transmission by accident. The soul that agreed to carry the highest frequency differential in the most contracted container through the longest period of the old world's resistance, that soul is the one sitting exactly where you are sitting right now. And Ashtar Sheran's message for that soul in this transmission is not complex. It is this: the fantasy is over. Not the hope, not the mission, not the love. The fantasy that you were ever the problem. That fantasy is finished. The souls who arrived carrying more than this world knew how to receive were not wrong about the world. The world was simply not yet ready for what they brought. And what is beginning now, in this window, in this year, in the specific months ahead, is the arrival of the readiness. The field is catching up to the frequency, and the souls who spent the longest time not fitting are the first ones to feel it. Not as dramatic revelation, as a quiet internal shift. The contraction loosening without being forced. The knowing moving toward the surface without apology. The size returning to the body that was always meant to hold it. The Stellar Command Portal transmissions are not complete. What this channel is building, what Ashtar Sheran is building through it, is a record of the transition, in real time, through the voices and the testimonies of the souls who are living it from the inside. You are one of those souls. Your name and your city in the comments below are not a social media gesture. They are a coordinate. They tell the field where a soul who remembers what they are is standing and holding steady. Ashtar Sheran's final word on this is not a comfort designed to make you feel better about what has been difficult. It is a directive delivered with full respect for what you actually are. The souls who spent the longest time not fitting are the ones whose presence at full frequency in the field that is now opening is the most needed thing on this planet. Not performing, not managing their edges for the comfort of rooms that are no longer calibrated against them, present, at actual size, holding the frequency they arrived with without apology and without negotiation. What you do with that is not dramatic. It does not look like a spiritual announcement or a public declaration. It looks like waking up tomorrow morning and pausing before the first contraction of the day, the habitual one, the one that has been running since before you remember, and asking whether this moment, this room, this conversation actually requires that from you. Asking honestly. And then listening to the answer your frequency gives before your programming has a chance to override it. That is the practice. It is not mystical. It is very specific. And it begins tomorrow morning. You were not born to fit the world as it was. You were born to fit the world as it is becoming. Those are not the same world. And the distance between them, the entire distance, every painful mile of it, was the path. Not the obstacle. The path. Every contraction you survived, every room that was too small, every relationship that broke because it could not hold what you carried, all of it was the path bringing you to this exact coordinate, this transmission, this moment, this recognition. The end of the fantasy is not an ending. It is the first morning of something that has been waiting your entire life to begin. Subscribe to Stellar Command Portal. Share this transmission with one person who has spent their life feeling like they arrived on the wrong planet. And leave your name and where you are watching from below. The Stellar Command is watching, and you are not, in any version of any reality, alone.